Hi guys, in this video we will be discussing the Spanish-American War. We are going to be explaining the significance of 1898, the Spanish-American War. We're also going to explain why the Spanish-American War moved the United States into a position of a world power, and we are going to describe the economic effects of the Spanish-American War on the United States. When we are finished, you will have the opportunity to analyze primary documents about the Spanish-American War. First, let's talk about what foreign policy is. When we talked about the Progressive Era, we were talking mostly about domestic policy. Those are laws that have to do with issues at home, things like taxation or the breaking up of trusts. Now we're going to talk about foreign policy. Foreign policy is a country's policies towards another country. So, in the United States, control of the foreign policy is divided between the executive and legislative branch. So the Constitution gives the President and the Congress both control of foreign policy. For example, the President can negotiate treaties, but Congress has to vote to ratify them. The President and the Secretary of State are the ones who handle the day-to-day diplomacy. They negotiate with other countries. They send ambassadors to meet with representatives from other nations. They might even meet with foreign leaders. But it's Congress who is going to approve funding and for their policies, and it's Congress who also has the power to declare war according to the U.S. Constitution. So, traditionally, the United States stayed out of foreign affairs. President Washington, when he left office, he, in a speech, warned Americans to stay out of foreign entanglements. So for 150 years, the United States remained isolated from the rest of the world. Foreign policy deals with the national interests of the country, including security from attack, protecting American investments, and promoting the American democracy and way of life. Alright, so the Spanish Empire had been a big, powerful empire that was very lucrative and generated a lot of money and power for the Spanish crown. But by 1890, there had been a series of revolutions and independence movements that led to the reduction of the size of the Spanish Empire. So the only thing that remained a part of the Spanish Empire were Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and a few other islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. Cuba, in particular, was a big part of the Spanish Empire, and it was populated by mostly peasants who worked on the sugar and tobacco plantations, and many of these plantations were owned by the U.S. investors. In 1894, the United States placed a tariff on imported sugar, and this led to a high rise of unemployment and poverty on the island of Cuba. So, in 1895, a war for independence began, led by a man named Jose Marti and other Cuban exiles who had been in the United States, fleeing the Spanish government, and decided to return to declare independence on behalf of the Cuban people. Spain reacted by sending the Spanish army and trying to put down this revolution by using very brutal methods. And many people were imprisoned, and they died of disease and starvation in the prisons. So the American press played a very big role in the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, because newspaper magnates like Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World and William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal began to circulate newspapers with sensationalized news. This is known as yellow journalism. Essentially, it's what we call today fake news. Newspapers would deliberately exaggerate stories in order to sell more papers. And when they reported on the Spanish-American War, these exaggerations led to increased humanitarian and economic concerns for the people of Cuba. For example, this cartoon shows American sentiment towards Spanish rule in Cuba. You know, Spain is portrayed as a monster. There is blood on his hands, and he is essentially slaughtering American troops. I'll show you in a minute what this means. The main sailors murdered by Spain. Okay, so another reason that the war broke out in 1898 was the Delome letter. This is a letter that the Spanish ambassador wrote and published in American newspapers. And in it, he essentially calls President McKinley weak. This is very insulting for President McKinley, and the American people do not find that amusing and support a war against Spain. So the spark, the main cause, the immediate cause of the Spanish-American War in 1898 is the sinking of an American ship, the USS Maine. So the Navy had been sent to Cuba to protect the lives and properties of Americans who were living in Cuba. And there was an explosion that sunk the ship in Havana Harbor. The cause of the explosion is unknown, but 258 sailors were killed, and Hearst and Pulitzer used their papers to put all the blame on Spain, even though there was not enough evidence to support that Spain had indeed sunk the ship. So Americans were outraged and called for war. President McKinley addressed Congress and asked for their permission to intervene in Cuba. He said, "Our acts hitherto have been an unselfish desire for peace and prosperity in Cuba. The forced intervention of the United States as a neutral to stop the war may be briefly summarized as follows. First, in the cause of humanity, to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, and miseries now existing there, it is our duty, for it is right at our door. Second, we owe it to our citizens in Cuba to terminate the conditions that deprive them of legal protection. Third, the right to intervene may be justified by the serious injury to the commerce, trade, and business of our people. Fourth, the present condition of affairs in Cuba is a constant menace to our peace. All these and others I need not mention, with the resulting strained relations, are a constant menace to our peace and compel us to keep a semi-war footing with a nation with which we were at peace." So essentially, President McKinley is listing all the reasons why the United States can no longer be a friend of Spain's, and that war is needed. And so Congress agrees, and war is declared. But Congress declares war with one condition, and that is the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment says that the United States will assist Cuba in gaining its independence, but it cannot annex Cuba. It cannot make Cuba a property of the United States. So once the United States would help Cuba gain its independence, it would withdraw its troops. That was the condition that Congress made for declaring war against Spain. So let's talk about some of the highlights of the Spanish-American War. First, you need to know that the Spanish-American War was fought on two fronts. Because the Spanish had colonies in the Pacific and the Caribbean Ocean, the United States is fighting them on both sides. So in the Philippines, the United States Navy was sent to aid the Filipino rebels who were also wanting their independence from Spain, and they were able to defeat the Spanish ships at Manila Bay, and the Philippines also became independent of Spanish rule. Over in the Caribbean, Teddy Roosevelt, who would become the President of the United States and whom we've spoken about before, he is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he is going to be leading a volunteer force of cavalrymen who fight the Spanish in Cuba, and they defeat them at the Battle of San Juan Hill. And this battle pretty much marks the end of the Spanish-American War there and guarantees that Cuba will be granted its independence. So the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1898, and this treaty is going to grant Cuba its independence. As a part of this treaty, the United States will also gain some territory. They gain Puerto Rico and Guam, and they're also able to purchase the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. So at the end of the Spanish-American War, the United States had gained territory in Puerto Rico and also Guam and the Philippines, and Cuba is granted its independence, but the United States still has some control there. And then you have the Spanish Empire reduced to pretty much what you see here. At the end of the war, another amendment was passed in 1901. The Platt Amendment dealt with the relationships between Cuba and the United States. So according to the Platt Amendment, Cuba would not be able to forfeit their independence to any other country. So Cuba couldn't say to Canada, for instance, hey, we want to be a part of your country. The Platt Amendment also stated that Cuba could not go into extreme debt, and it stated that the United States was going to get a naval base in Cuba, which is Guantanamo Bay, which is still part of the United States territory today, and we have a prison there. The United States, as a part of the Platt Amendment, would also reserve the right to intervene in Cuba anytime it felt like it needed to go in there to preserve order. So this is going to mark the relationship between Cuba and the United States for decades, leading up to the revolution by Fidel Castro. So again, the Platt Amendment gives Cuba its independence, but there are conditions to that independence, and it makes the United States a dominant partner in their relationship. The war is very important because it marks a turning point in history. You need to know the significance of the year 1898, which is the Spanish-American War, and that is because at the end of the war, Spain's empire is completely reduced, and the United States emerges as a dominant world power. So for the first time, the United States makes an appearance on the world stage, and going forward will continue to be a major force in foreign politics. So please know that 1898 is a very important year in American history. That brings us to the end of the lecture. If you have any questions, bring them to class, and thanks for watching.